Welcome, everyone, to today's interview. It is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Scaturro, who is the Eric and Jane Miller Chief Conservator at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Previously, she was the head conservator at the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sarah is a doctoral candidate at Bard Graduate Center, writing her dissertation on the development of costume conservation in the US and UK during the 20th century. And I know a lot of people are excitedly awaiting that. Sarah writes and lectures on theoretical and practical issues related to the conservation of fashion, and I'm particularly grateful to her for her brilliant ideas and generous guidance as I try to orient myself in the fully fascinating world of fashion conservation. Sarah, thank you for agreeing to answer our two questions, and here they are. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? If not, why not? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
Well, thank you so much, Jules, for inviting me to answer these two very difficult and thought-provoking questions. I'm not a performance conservator, but I think I know why you might have asked me, and we can get into that. But first, to your first question, can performance be conserved? I'm going to say yes and no. Just so I can have it all. I would say there are pretty straightforward instances where performance pieces can be conserved and can be conserved satisfactorily, I think. And this usually is when there is a defined understanding with an artist, or a defined kind of stated intention by the artist or their foundations or representatives about how something should be performed or shown. And the documentation process seems pretty straightforward, and there's an existing model essentially. And so, for example, the Cleveland Museum of Art, we have collected what we call durational pieces or time-based media for several decades now. But usually these have been videos or films from artists such as like Anna Mendieta, say. Or we've also had a few multi-channel electronic works. One that we're going to be showing soon is from the artist Emeka Ogba. And so in those instances, normal documentation models, I think, work well. We do have one, what I would consider full-on performance piece, and we acquired that in 2017. It was our first performance piece by Pierre Huiga. That is a 2011 piece called The Name Announcer. And that one, I think, can be effectively conserved because we have a pretty clear understanding from the artist himself what that piece consists of. And we're able to document our efforts, and we're able to enact the piece and even loan the piece with great effectiveness. So in those cases, I think, yes, performance can be conserved and then reperformed or performed again. And we can talk about whether there's a difference with those. But there are some less straightforward instances, and I think one of the reasons you've asked me these questions is because of my expertise in fashion. And so I'm really going to be playing to that question. Can the fashion performance be conserved? And I would say no. And this is because fashion itself is something really different. And fashion conservation as it stands now is, I think, inadequate to address issues of performance. And that is because traditional notions in the conservation of fashion have focused solely on issues of materiality. And this focus on materiality leaves out one of the most important parts of fashion, which is the body, the living body. And so we have a lot of material effects of conservation that we see. So we see, storage boxes and tissue paper and hangers, and needle and thread, and we even have surrogate bodies. We have mannequins and dress forms. But what we're actually like missing is the flesh and blood. And so if we think about the fashion performance, we can talk about what that might be, but we are unsuited at this moment to really address even conserving what that is, because we're always kind of going around this missing thing at the core, and that missing thing at the core is the entity of the human body. I'm sure I know you've been reading up a lot on fashion, and first and foremost, fashion is a lived and situated, embodied experience, right? So we will never be able to get back that exact moment that something was worn by a specific person in a specific context with the specific people viewing it. I mean, we will never get that back. We can try to get close to it by, you know, reperforming it, maybe putting that same person back into those clothes, but their body might have changed in the meantime. You know, maybe we can get somebody else back into that ensemble, but the audience might be different. And so we can maybe achieve an approximation. But again, what we might be missing is the fact that fashion is an affective process. And by that, I mean the act of wearing has an affect on the human body, and the interaction between the clothing and the individual is part of that key fashion moment. Fashion is sensual, right? It feels like something, it sounds like something, it smells like something. And it also can be viewed differently by different people viewing it. And so like there's this whole fashion kind of moment that like we're unable to really access it, I think, and re-perform in a very satisfying way. Now we can try to document the fashion moment, right? And sometimes the documentation of the fashion moment in itself becomes the more important fashion object, right? But in that case, it's an object, it's not necessarily a performance. And by that, I mean, you know, the fashion sketch or the fashion photograph that's in the magazine, right? That's the thing that's really important. The fashion video, we now have digital fashion, so animations. So those are things that are objects of fashion in their own right, but might not, you know, again, satisfy the requirement of what is the performance of fashion. And then we also have to think again for fashion that it also has a design function. It's a design object, not just like an art object, right? And so it has to function in order to be fully realized. And so if we think about how fashion functions, you know, it's a body covering, it can shield the body, protect the body from sun, give it warmth, but it's also this sign or symbol of identities, and it can be shed and put on in multiple variations and iterations, and it can be reframed as needed. And then it's also incredibly contextual. And so you can have the same fashion on the same body with the same people viewing it, but if it's in a wrong context, like if you're wearing evening, you know, attire to your day job or your, you know, pajamas to a ball, then it might not work. And then the last thing we want to think about with the fashion and fashion performance is that fashion by its very nature is all about change, right? It's about novelty and change. And so that can maybe be a good thing for the performance, right? If we're not expecting the performance to stay the same, then maybe that's the way into preserving fashion as performance. But what we also need to remember is that as time goes on, the act of performing older fashion moments becomes more and more anachronistic, right? Because the people then wearing the clothes don't have the same understanding of what it might have felt like to wear those clothes. And the person viewing those clothes, the clothes seem now more and more and more out of fashion. And so I think as time goes on and you have these anachronisms, then maybe, the clothes are fitting stranger, they look stranger, that it's almost as if fashion then can become costume, and then we can just resort to like theater, right? And then maybe it can be conserved. I have no idea. So yes and no, and I hope I've answered the first question.
Honestly, that was so fascinating. You bring up so many great points, and really, for me, just everything you said is really reinforcing what I've started to understand, which is that I think there is such a huge connection between fashion conservation and performance conservation. One of the things we're doing in this project is not reinventing the wheel and looking at places where conservators and conservation traditions have already grappled with some of the questions that we're looking at in terms of performance. And it's really clear to me that that you, both in your work, actively as a textile conservator and in your work as a scholar looking at the history of textile conservation, you're really finding performance coming up in all these different ways. And I have so many questions that I could ask in follow-up. So one thing I'd like to ask is, you used a term that I've heard you use before, which is the fashion performance. And a question that I've heard you pose before is, what or when is the fashion performance? Is that something you could talk about a little bit more?
Sure. So what and when is the fashion performance? I mean, it's all the time. It's everything. It's every time we put on clothes. Although one thing I would like to maybe even ask you back, though, does a performance require an audience? And so is the fashion performance when I put on my yoga leggings? I don't know. But is that fashion performance when I'm wearing my leggings in the grocery store? Yes, I think very much so. I think I'm looking this way. I've chosen to look this way. Now, there are a lot of people that say, oh, they don't care about fashion. But I think if we change out the word fashion for dress, which is what is more accepted as just general clothing, I think it still holds true. Everybody wears clothes. You choose your clothing for some reason, and everybody is a clothed body. So the fashion performance is when you're wearing something. In essence, you're performing fashion, you're performing dress, you're putting it on your body, and you're engaging with the world through the mediation of whatever fabric it is that you're putting on your body, whatever form it takes. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer for you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great answer. But I know you've also thought about, okay, if we understand, if we're ready to grant performance as connected to fashion, then the question is, what is the performance that we're even looking to conserve? Is it the everyday performance of the leggings in the grocery store? Is it the runway? Is another example that you gave. Is it the way that a garment was presented in a retail situation? Are we looking to the way it was styled on a mannequin in the store window, or are we looking to the vision that the designer had in their head before the runway show happened, and actually, the model had to be switched out last minute and it wasn't quite what they wanted because their makeup artist was sick or something like that. Because we also talked about how much distance there often is between a runway show and how fashion is worn, not even just by people on the street, but even celebrities and people who are seeing reproduced in magazines. They're not looking like models on a runway.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about a spectrum. I would say, right? There's spectrums of performability or performativeness or performativity, I guess. Yes, the height of the fashion performance will likely be the red carpet, the gala, the runway show. Then though you can get into the question of what is the most authentic fashion performance, and some museums, such as one I've worked at, might define the most authentic fashion performance as the one that stems directly from the designer's mind themselves. So the couture piece that was sent down the runway, not even the couture piece that was bought by the woman who then had it modified, like the bust, maybe being brought up a little for modesty reasons or whatever. So some scholars, I think, would argue that the primary fashion moment performance moment is the moment the artist or designer births this concept to the world. But I think there's an argument that the fashion performance moment is also that person who then takes the clothes, puts it on their bodies, and then presents themselves to the world with this ensemble that they've somehow put together. And I think that is just as authentic of a fashion performance moment. And there are days performance is better or worse. I mean, there's days where you're feeling pretty great, and you look good, the clothes feel good, the audience looking at you knows you look good, it fits the context appropriately, you're dressed perfectly or the way you want to be dressed at that moment for that situation, for that weather, so there are good days, and then there are bad days. It can be bad performance days.
It's also interesting to think that kind of platonic ideal of the garment is something that only comes into being with ready to wear, right? Until you have the industrialization of fashion, you don't have the designer creating a garment kind of independently of a given body, right? Previously, you might have a design, but the design would always have to be adapted for the person wearing it. There would always kind of be that interplay. But then after fashion gets industrialized, after you have ready to wear, obviously the whole industry completely changes coming into the 20th century. You do have this idea that the designer can just design a garment, right, in the abstract without a kind of given body present, right? And then that then gets kind of sent out in a million copies to be performed by different people.
I mean, but I do think even before the Industrial Revolution, there were trends, right? There were other ways of communicating fashions that would then be copied, regardless of whether it really looked good on a certain body or coloration or anything. And those fashions came out, they were often on dolls or prints or, dressmaker studios, mantua makers, tailors. So that's where fashion is this concept of this, it's very hard to define, but essentially this idea of change for change's sake or novelty, it's just constantly pushing. I would say, I only say forward because that's, as we know, as time can only go forward, right? But it's just pushing ahead or, I think the body and how people relate to a piece of clothing, it's so individualized that if we agree that the fashion performance is anytime fashion is put on the body, then there's, infinite number of performances that can happen, potential performances that have happened, and they're always different. And so I guess to go to your second question of what does it mean to conserve performance, and you know, my first kind of thought nihilistically was like, well, it means futility, right? Like, we'll never be able to conserve something perfectly as it was at a certain time. You know, everything we do is temporary. We'll never be able to conserve everything forever. You know, it doesn't happen. And so, of course, then, you know, that's really, you know, futile kind of thing to think about. And so if we pan in closely, you know, maybe our goal isn't to conserve things for the next generation, or so that it can be sustainably used a bit longer or more than it should have been. And then we need to recognize that there will always be this issue of change and variability, and that these subjective truths are always contingent, right? So can things be conserved? Can performance be conserved? It will always be changing. And so what we can try to do is recapture the spirit of things, but also understand that what might have captured the spirit of something at one point in time might not be the same thing that captured that same spirit in another time, right? And then to apply that to fashion, right? Again, the point I made about anachronisms in fashion, and you know, you can say everything old is new again. Whatever was out of style comes into style, but then it very quickly goes out of style. And when it comes back into style, it's a different kind of style. It's not that exact same kind of style. You know, people's bodies have changed, or their hairstyles may be different, or, you know, whatever. And so, what does it mean to conserve performance? I will settle on it means to somehow grasp the original spirit of whatever was performed, and to be able to reproduce that spirit. And sometimes that might require different material things and even actions and bodies to do that.
Thank you so much. That is such a rich answer. One thing that I really love about working on performance conservation is exactly as you say, that this problem of ephemerality and this problem of, in a way, futility is not just limited to performance, right?
Right.
I love that your answer was, can the fashion, to the question, can the fashion performance be conserved, was no. Because you said you think that the discipline isn't there right now. So what would have to change, or what would you like to see change in order for performance to be something that could be taken into account in the world of fashion conservation?
I think we would, as a profession, have to accept the risk of having things be reborn as a starter. And that then, of course, opens up a whole bunch of things, not the least being that just materially, fashion is very fragile, and there are fabrics that literally are falling apart and powdering and shattering, and so how would you even get that on a body, nevertheless perform it, right? And it also, there are dresses that, or garments that just look like sad, and they don't have a freshness. And I've written a little bit, and I've thought a lot about the word fresh and what fresh means in the context of fashion. And I do think it's a pretty crucial aspect in a lot of fashion moments, is this idea of freshness and novelty and life. I mean, fresh, right, is something that's got life still in it to some aspect or some part of it. And so I think what it would take for us to try to achieve more accurately, the conservation of fashion performance would be, yes, accepting putting a body back into a garment, trying to make the material remains be as fresh as possible, which is something we're already doing. But then maybe, and this is something, Jules, you and I have talked about, is replicas, the idea of replicating the garments so that they have that freshness and that they fit that body. And we could talk about like Kim Kardashian, right? Wearing the Monroe dress. And what, after a lot of thought, what was almost more troubling for me was that the original Monroe dress did not have the same spirit when it was put on Kim's body, because it didn't match her skin tone well and it didn't fit her shape. And she wasn't naked underneath. She was wearing like control wear and underwear. And the spirit of the Monroe dress would have lived on better, I think, had there been a replica that matched her skin tone and allowed her shape to be fully, enclosed within it. And that, of course, she wasn't wearing underwear, so that truly the shape of the dress was conforming to her true body shape. In that sense, that would have been a more satisfying performance of that dress, in my opinion. So I might have veered a little bit away from your question about what it might take to have fashion conservation really conserve the performative aspects of fashion. It's an area that is really, I think, uncomfortable for conservators who have struggled to ascertain and maintain the legitimacy of preserving fashion even as an object, because for so long fashion, so intrinsically tied to the body that objects that were held in collections would often be pulled and put onto the bodies of wealthy people who somehow had some sort of impact over the actual collection itself, whether they were donating money or actually leading or guiding it. And so in those instances, damage, right? And so I guess another aspect would be, if we do put things on a human body, we have a certain amount of risk, and we're going to have to accept a certain amount of damage. And then that's where we ask that question: is that amount of damage that we're allowing acceptable?